Skylabs, bringing you another video. Gonna be a really fun one. This is kind of different than what we usually do. I really wanted to be able to help some people that might have trouble troubleshooting their equipment, to maybe give you an idea of whether something needs to come in for repair, or possibly maybe it's something that you can fix on your own. And in this video, we're gonna go over how to troubleshoot a turntable or receiver, integrated amplifier, or separates. And we're also going to go over how to troubleshoot your speakers. I really think this could help save a lot of money, as a lot of these pieces of equipment come into our shop with these issues. And not to say that you shouldn't have it checked out by a technician, but at least you can figure out which one of these components is giving you the trouble, and then that way you only have to take in one piece of equipment rather than all three. We're gonna timestamp this one, so if down the road you have a problem and you need to refer back to it, you can look throughout the video and see exactly where you need to go. We're gonna start out with an amplifier or receiver. These are the same troubleshooting techniques I use every single day, as I do all of the repair check-ins and I do the testing for all of the equipment that comes in for purchase. I even looked through our books last week because I wanted to get an idea of how many turntables and amplifiers and receivers I've done this to, and last year it was over 390. While I'm the last person to say that I'm exceptional or great at anything, I will tell you I've gotten really good at figuring out problems with these three pieces of equipment and whether or not they need to go to a certified technician that can do some deep dive troubleshooting, or whether maybe somebody like you could go through, do a little bit of cleaning, make some changes to your turntable, and solve the issue for yourself. With technicians retiring like crazy right now, this could save you a lot of money and a lot of time shipping your equipment to other parts of the country to get it repaired. I don't think you're gonna wanna miss this one. Please refer back to it if you need to. If you've got something that's worked for you, make sure you put that down in the comments. It's all about spreading the knowledge, giving people the ability to fix some of these that might be in a more remote location. I'd love to hear yours. If you have one, leave it in the comments. Really appreciate it. We're gonna get into the video. Let's get going. Okay, so if you're having issues with your amplifier or receiver and maybe dropouts, one channel's dropping out, or you don't have sound at all, this is a very common thing, especially with vintage audio equipment. The first thing I do when I get a receiver in for purchase or for repair is do what I'm about to do, and that is wiggle every single one of these knobs and see if I can get audio to come out of both channels. The easiest way to do that, one, is you want to make sure you only have one set of speakers hooked up at the same time. You want to make sure your EQ or any other extras is out of the equation. We just want your source, your amplifier, and your speakers. In this case, because I've got a receiver sitting here, I'm actually going to use the AM section for a couple of reasons. One, I don't have to worry about this FM mute button right here being faulty and not giving me FM signal. And two, I don't have to worry about a source being an issue or a cable being an issue. The fact that AM is built in here, I can pretty much tell if the amplifier and preamp are working because of just getting static on the AM. So all I do is turn the unit on, go to AM, bring up my volume, and we have static in both of our speakers. This is a good sign. Now we just need to see if those dropouts are coming from possibly a dirty switch or if this is something that needs to be repaired. And the way I go about doing that really is to exercise these knobs. This is something you should almost do maybe once a month, especially with vintage electronics. To do that, you really just, with the unit off before you start playing it, you just go through and wiggle all these knobs, push all these buttons, and if there's any kind of debris or buildup, what we're hoping to do is kind of remove that without having to get in there with a can of electronics cleaner. So that's something I usually do once a month, but we're going to do it right now to this one to see if we can get it to drop out and see if this is just a basic service, maybe something you could do on your own with a can of deoxit, or if this needs to go to a technician. And on AM and both channels, I'm going to start moving these buttons in at a slow pace to see if there's any dead spots. The usual culprits are tape monitor. This button rarely ever gets used, and when you engage it, it kills the amplifier. So this is one of those problematic ones you should pay attention to. A lot of times wiggling it left to right and pushing it in very slowly, you can see if one channel is cutting out. Right now my left channel is cutting out and I have it halfway compressed. So that tape monitor switch definitely needs to be cleaned. Got a mono stereo button, the FM muting button, and then the volume. You really want to work these back and forth. Balance knob, work it back and forth. And there's two more that people sometimes neglect. One of them is definitely the speaker selector. A lot of times if I move these and I'm just wiggling it, the speaker A output, I can get one channel to drop out without going to the next position. And that's what I'm seeing here. So this speaker pot really needs to get cleaned. That could be causing a dropout. The tape monitor button could be causing the dropout. And then your input selector switch is another culprit. And once again, I'm getting dropouts without going to the next input. So that needs to get cleaned. And really, any technician that would take this in for repair, the first thing they're going to do is clean these pots, because there's no point in testing anything else unless we can alleviate the possibility of these pots being dirty enough to kill the signal going from the preamplifier to the amplifier. So, wiggle knobs. And if you ever hear that sound right there, that is my phone being too close to the receiver. I'm hoping the mic picks that up, because I've heard this. We've had people complain about this. You know, as soon as I remove the phone, it's gone. But what that is you got bleed coming through your phone. So if you have a device too close, especially a streamer or some digital type of source, and you hear that pulsating sound, that's what that is.
I wonder if you just disabled either your cellular or your Wi-Fi.
Well, maybe, I'm not sure. So if you're not troubleshooting a receiver, you've got an integrated amplifier. Let's look at a couple ways to do this. You could use an MP3 player, use your phone, use a CD player, anything that you trust, you know works, you trust your cables. If your cables are bad, there's no point in troubleshooting anything. We throw cables away all the time. It's always a good idea, even if they're not the greatest cables, to have an extra set that you know work, that you've tested with another device, because there's nothing worse than troubleshooting something and finding out later you had bad cables. I've got my phone hooked up, I'm going into auxiliary, and all I'm gonna do is play a song on my phone and bring the volume up. Now once again, this unit hasn't been cleaned, so I'm just gonna go through and kind of wiggle the knobs, and I'm gonna move these levers to try and see if there's any dead spots in them. And you wanna wiggle them back and forth too, you see that? And that is, not only do you want to actuate them in the way that they were intended, but you also want to actuate them left to right, because you can get dropouts that way too. It can cause one speaker not to work. So use a phone, use an MP3 player, use a CD player. Make sure you've got a source that you trust. Make sure you've got cables that you trust. And that's the way I test an amplifier or integrated without an FM or AM. And we can't get one of our channels to put out sound. What's the next step? Well, okay, so let's say you've done your wiggle test, we've manipulated all the controls, if it's the source, or you can see if it's the amplifier. And right now I've got sound coming out of the right side. I've got nothing on the left. I go to the left, I wiggle all my knobs. It's not kicking in. Next thing I want to do is power the unit off. I want to unplug the left and the right coming from my phone to verify that both of my audio cables are good. I'm going to turn it back on. And the right channel, I still have audio in. The left channel's bad. So now I figured out my phone's good, the cable's good. There's something wrong with this amplifier. For some reason, we're not getting audio through the back, into the amplifiers, and then out to the speakers. So at this point, I would say this needs to go to a technician so they can do some troubleshooting and see where the problem is somewhere internally. So you've gone through, you wiggle all your switches. You've messed with all the potentiometers. We still have a channel out. We've got audio over here. No audio over here. Next thing to do would be to test your speakers. And how do we do that? We shut the unit off. And we come over here and we unhook our right and we put it in our left, like so. Make sure your amplifier is switched off before doing this. So now we've got our right speaker going into our left channel, and we've got our left speaker going into our right channel. If, when you power this back on, now we have audio on this side, but we do not have audio on this side, that means we have a problem with the amplifier and the speakers are working fine. So let's power it on and see what happens. So now we verified that both speakers are working coming out of the right channel. That means we have a problem inside of the amplifier somewhere, and once again, it needs to be serviced. All right, another thing you want to check, if your amplifier or receiver has pre-outs and main ins, sometimes they have jumpers going from the pre-out to the main in, and sometimes they have switches. And these switches, since most of the time they never get used, these can definitely be an issue. We see this a lot. People bring in an amplifier or receiver that has that switch and they don't have a channel working. We've gone through, we've wiggled all the switches, we've toggled all the toggles, and we're still not getting audio. Another good thing to check before you take it to a technician would be to loosen the screw and manipulate that control. And we're going to do it right now. Hold on. All right, all we need to do here is loosen this bottom screw. And this just keeps you from accidentally bumping it. And once again, we want to exercise this control. Literally work it back and forth several times. If there's any carbon in there, we want to get rid of that. We'll put it back to normal and turn it on. Let's see if we have both channels again. And we have both channels. And you can see how that cuts the sound if I put it to separate, and brings it back in if I put it back up. And a lot of times you'll find that there'll be a dead spot in there that could be causing one of those channels to drop out. Or another way you might see your pre-out main ends would be with jumpers. And sometimes integrateds or receivers that don't have this switch here, you'll see what are called jumper pins. And these just do a physical connection from the pre-out to the main in without using a switch. So I'm going to put this in the separated position with the pins in, and we should have audio, because instead of using the switch to bridge these two RCAs together, we're actually using a physical connection. So when I power this back on, it should still work. And there we go. Now, if I were to take those pins out, I'm gonna power the unit off. If I were to take these out and leave that switch in that position, it's not gonna work again. So we should have no audio now. There's a relay click, we have no audio. And the reason is because this switch is not jumping these RCAs anymore, and I don't have jumper pins in there. Now, for all you people that might like to purchase parts or repair units on eBay, I'm gonna give you a little tip here. This is something that people look out for when something is advertised for parts or repair. You might wanna look at the back panel. If you know a model has pre-out main in and it needs these jumpers, if there are no jumpers in that photograph, it might be a possibility that somebody removed those and they don't realize that they need to be there in order for the amplifier to work. We see this where I'll have somebody come in, they bought, let's say, a piece of stereo equipment in the 70s, they added an EQ, or maybe they had a Bose set of 901s. Sometimes they'll bring in and they'll say, my stereo's not working, we get a relay click. The next thing I'm gonna look for is if by chance they're missing their pre-out main in jumpers. If you are somebody that's looking to get a really good deal on a stereo, check the pictures on eBay auctions. You might find that a receiver or an amplifier just needs these pins put in to make it work. You're still taking a risk, and there could be other issues with it, but you could get lucky. So anyway, pre-out main in jumpers, definitely check those, make sure they're there, and if there is a switch, definitely toggle these switches back and forth, as they can be a culprit causing a channel to drop out or just to fail altogether. And another thing to check for, you want to make sure the power's off before you remove the top. But a lot of times these amplifiers have internal fuses that are not located at an easy accessible place. And what you want to do is, with the unit powered off, unhook one of these fuses and give it an eye inspection, or if you have a voltmeter, put it on ohms, see if you have resistance through there. If you have resistance through there, the fuse is good. If not, grab some new fuses. Sometimes fuses, especially that are 40 years old or older, just fail. They've had current going through them for 40 years and they just decide to go. The thing you want to make sure though is that you're putting the same value in. Do not just grab any random fuse. You want to make sure it's the same voltage, and you do not want to bypass a fuse ever. Don't put tinfoil in there. Don't put anything in there other than what is recommended by the manufacturer for a fuse. And you might be surprised how many times it starts working once you put a new fuse in it. If the new fuse blows, that's when it's time to take it to a technician. Just make sure you're being safe, make sure the unit's powered off, maybe even unplug the unit for an extra safety precaution. I don't think with electricity you can ever be too safe. So check your amplifier or receiver for possibly a fuse that's blown on the inside. And another thing we see quite a bit, and I'm not going to visually show this, but if you are somebody that runs two sets of speakers, and at louder volumes, or when you bring up the volume control, if the speaker relay clicks out, I would check that your speakers are at least 8 ohms or more. If you have one set of speakers that's 6 ohms or 4 ohms, you cannot run 4 speakers on it. We see this a lot. We get phone calls, people bring in their equipment, and they don't understand why when they crank up their amplifier, or they get even to a moderate level, they lose their sound. And that is why. They're running 2 sets of speakers, and one set of those speakers or both sets of those speakers are below 8 ohms, and these amplifiers just cannot handle that type of draw. So make sure your speakers are 8 ohms or more if you're going to run 2 sets at a time. Let's take a look at a preamplifier and an amplifier. Maybe you've got only one channel coming out and you're not sure if it's the amplifier or the preamplifier, and rather than shipping both pieces to a repair shop or taking both in for repair, we can do a couple troubleshooting things to figure out if it's preamp or the amplifier. So let's do that. I'm gonna bring up the volume here. And as of right now, we've got audio coming out of the right side. Our left side is dead. And what we're gonna do is we are gonna power the unit off. And we are gonna unplug the preamp going to the amplifier and swap the RCA cables. And what happens now is if our right channel is still working, we know that our preamplifier is providing sound because we just swapped the cables. So I'm going to turn the unit back on. And our right channel is still working. So that tells us that both sides of the preamp have been providing audio to the amplifier. However, the left channel on the amplifier is not working for some reason. And at this point, that would definitely be a reason to take it into a technician. There's nothing else needed to test here if you've already swapped your speaker cables like we did in a previous section and tested that both speakers are working. We've already tested our source in a previous segment, so we know these wires are good, and we know that our phone is putting out audio to both channels. So that would be how you test and see whether or not your preamp is working or your amp is working and what is the issue. And just a tip for everybody out there, if you are getting static and popping sounds or hum and your volume control is down on any source, it doesn't matter what source you're on. If you're getting static and pop, and when you turn up the volume or take it all the way down, if you're still getting static or pop, that means you need to take it to a technician. That's not a dirty switch or a dirty control. That is most likely a transistor that has gone noisy, and unless you have troubleshooting skills to go in there and figure out which transistor it is, it's time to take it into a technician. So hum, static, snap, crackle, pop, any of those types of things, regardless of where the volume is, it needs to go to a repair technician. The next thing I want to test is phono. And before we put a turntable on this, because a lot of times turntables are more finicky than amplifiers, let's test to make sure the internal phono preamp is working correctly. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do it with our phone. Not a phono, not a turntable. We're going to do it with our phone because we've been testing things all day using this phone and this cable, and you can test your phono just fine with these two devices. That way we can look at the turntable to see if it's what's causing the problem. Right now, I just want to see if the phono preamplifier inside of this amplifier or receiver is working. So how do we do that? We take our RCA cables and we plug them into phono. If you're ever hooking up your RCA cables to your amplifier or receiver in the phono position, make sure it's turned off. That phono stage has more gain to it, and so it's pretty easy to get a pop or a click and really do damage to your speaker. So make sure your receiver or amplifier is off anytime you change these out. But right now we've got our phone plugged into the phono. We've got both of our volumes turned down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my volume up to about a quarter of the way up, 9 o'clock position, and then I'm going to slowly bring up my phone's audio. And right now we're not looking for quality of sound, we're just looking to see if we're getting both channels through both speakers, and we are. So don't think that you can't test an amplifier or receiver if you don't have a turntable. Anything that's got a variable output control on it, like a phone, some CD players have variable outputs, some tuners have variable outputs. Most MP3 players have variable outputs. You just want something that's not full bore. You want to be able to attenuate the volume on your source and also attenuate it on the receiver, because that phono preamp with its extra gain is likely to cause damage to your speakers if you overdrive them. So This is the way I test phono preamps inside of receivers. That way I'm not worried about maybe a cartridge, a stylus, bad RCA cables on a turntable. There's a whole plethora of things that could be wrong with a turntable that can keep you from accurately figuring out if your phono preamp inside of your receiver or amplifier is working correct. And this does it great. So if you're questioning your phono preamp, plug in your phone, turn the treble up a quarter of the way, turn the bass down a quarter of the way, turn the volume on your phone down, turn the volume on your receiver down, and then slowly bring both of those volumes up, and you should have a pretty good indication of how the phono preamp inside of your amplifier or receiver is working. Okay, and the first thing we want to do with a turntable is we really want to make sure that our stylus is clean. If you don't use a stylus brush, you really should. Even playing immaculate records over time, you're going to get a little bit of dust buildup, and maybe it can cause one of your speakers to cut out. And also, if you have friends that come over, or maybe you have little ones that are using the turntable, you definitely want to make sure that your stylus is still in good shape, that it's not bent or the tip's not broke off. It doesn't take much if you're manually bringing the tone arm over to clip the end of the record and knock a stylus off. You want to make sure your tracking force is set correctly. You want to make sure that your turntable is in good working condition, because your styluses are not cheap, and it's nothing that you should have to replace very often if everything is working properly. So just give it a visual inspection if you can. Make sure it's straight, and make sure your stylus is still on the end of your cantilever there. Every once in a while, check on your stylus. Clean it if you need to. Pretend it's your armpit. Once you make sure your stylus is clean, the next thing I would do is move on to the cables. And being that these cables and a lot of these vintage turntables are so old, and the fact that a lot of them are built in, so you can't change them, really could cause a lot of problems. And the best way to do this is just to start a record, give yourself a little volume, and start wiggling the cables. You know, if they've been improperly stored or stored with a zip tie on them for long periods of time, it might have caused a dead spot or a break in that wire. And all you're trying to do is just give them a good wiggle, especially at the ends. That's a known problematic spot there. And see if you can get the sound to cut in and out. And if you do, if you can get the sound to cut out, you know that you need to replace the cables. If that's something that maybe intimidates you a little bit, definitely check in with a repair shop. It's not a hard process to do, but somebody local to you should be able to replace the cables. So stylus, cables, check those out first, and we'll get into the next one. And for the next one, we get this question all the time. People will call in, or they'll bring in their turntable and they'll say, something's wrong with it. My speakers are moving back and forth quite a bit when I don't even have a record playing, or I get this really low bass sound and it just builds and builds and builds. And usually the problem is isolation from your speakers. I'll ask them, where are your speakers placed and where is your turntable? A lot of times people will say, well, my turntable's on top of my speaker, or my speakers are on the same shelf or platform as my turntable. And this is what's causing that. Your bass frequencies are getting into your tone arm and they are getting amplified, and that's why it keeps on building. So you really need to improve the isolation from your turntable to the speakers. There are a lot of ways of doing that, but if you just want to test to see if that is the problem, I tell people, grab yourself a thick towel, fold it over a few times to where you got a nice cushion, and place it underneath your turntable. Obviously, if your turntable is sitting on your speakers, you got to find a different solution than that. I don't know if there's any amount of isolation, unless you go crazy, that's going to prevent that. So put the towel underneath it, set your turntable on top, see if that kills that low feedback hum, and if it does, then move to a more elegant permanent solution, which would be something like these right here. Sorbethane feet, try that. You might have to double these up, but this will help keep the low frequencies from getting into your turntable and then getting amplified by the tone arm or the amplifier, however you want to look at it. So, but first start with the towel, because everybody's got a towel, I hope, and see if that fixes it, because that is most likely the problem. Otherwise, it could be a ground issue. Make sure that your ground wire is seated correctly to the ground post. And another thing we hear from customers a lot is, I bought a turntable and it's really quiet, it's distorted, it doesn't sound good. And this is either one of two things. Either you have a phono preamp built into your turntable and you are going into your phono input on your stereo, or you don't have a phono preamp in your turntable and you don't have a phono preamp in your receiver. You only need one phono preamp. It either needs to be in the turntable or it needs to be in the amplifier receiver. Without one, or doubling and having two, you're gonna have problems either way. So you really just need to look in your owner's manual or find an owner's manual online if you don't know if your turntable has a phono preamp in it. And the way you can tell if your amplifier or receiver has a phono preamp in it is if it has an input labeled phono. If it has an input labeled phono, that is your phono preamp. You don't want to plug anything else into the phono preamp but a turntable. Hopefully that narrows that down a little bit. There's definitely a lot of information around phono preamps out there online, but you need one phono preamp, not two. And the next thing we hear quite a bit, people will bring in their turntables and they'll say, my speed is off, it's really erratic. And sometimes you have speed controls that are accessible from the top, and that's great. And we're going to do the same thing we did with the receiver, in that we're going to turn these back and forth several times. We just want to see if we can get the turntable to hold a better speed. And if we can, by turning these back and forth, then we know we just need to get inside and clean those pots. If after we do this, it's still racing forward and backwards, most likely there's an IC chip or there's something in the speed control circuit that has gone bad. You'll need a technician for that. But if after doing this, your speed corrects itself, then at this point, I would suggest it's not very difficult on most turntables to just get a can of deoxit or electronics cleaner and clean those pots. There are a lot of videos online on how to clean those pots. That would be the first thing I would go to if I was looking at a turntable that a customer was complaining about speed. Check those pots. Sometimes there are pots underneath. Once again, this is something where you just need to look in the manual and look at speed adjustment. A lot of times there are two pots underneath the turntable that you get a precision screwdriver and you just turn them there instead of here. So anyway, if you're having erratic speed trouble, check these first. If you're unable to fix it by exercising the speed control pots, then at that point you might want to take it in and have a service technician look at it. The next thing you want to do if you're having speakers drop out on you, reseating this head shell does wonders to fix that problem. A lot of times, just simply removing the head shell, and make sure your amplifier's off. I almost did it with it on. But you want to make sure your amplifier's off. Take the head shell off. If you have a removable head shell, put it back on and re-clamp it down. And make sure it's tight. You don't need to get vice grips or anything like that. Finger tight is good. That will sometimes alleviate that problem. I've got another thing you can try though too, because this works a lot of times as well. And what you want to do is there's 4 pins inside of this tone arm. And these are your contact pins that go to the head shell. And they are spring loaded. If that spring is not pushing back on those pins far enough, it's not making contact with your head shell. So I just take, this is a piece of straw, you can take a bamboo skewer and just push them in and out. All you're doing is getting that spring and getting its tension back. So that, because sometimes if a cartridge or head shell has been mounted on there for a long time. They've just gotten pushed in, and you just need to kind of massage that spring in order to get its tension back. Something that simple a lot of times can bring back a dead speaker or a dead channel out of your turntable. Don't overlook that step. It only takes a second, and that can save you a lot of problems right there. And one last thing, you've done all the other steps. Your stylus is clean. You've checked your cables to see if there's dead spots. You've reset your head shell. One more thing I would try is reversing your input cables. So take the right input and put it in the left, and put the left in the right, and see if the other speaker is now working. Because if the other speaker is now working, you know it's not the amplifier. You know it's an issue with your turntable. You know it's not the cables. There's another reason why you're having trouble. It could be a mute relay switch on the inside. There's a lot of things that could go wrong that you just need a technician to look at. So, and I got one more. This is kind of a hack. I'll admit that this is kind of a hack, but if you need to check and see real quick if a speaker is working or not, and be careful, don't do this on high-end speakers, piezo tweeters, that type of thing. And I don't recommend using a 9-volt battery, and you definitely don't want to hold this on there for very long. But just connecting a AAA battery or AA battery, you can hear that it's engaging both the woofer and the tweeter. That tells you at least you don't have a wire malfunction inside of the cabinet, and that, you know, the woofer and the tweeter is working. It's not maybe going to show you if it's blown or not, but it definitely lets you know if it's shorted open or if it's an open speaker. So that's a real quick test for you out there if you're maybe looking at buying a set of speakers at a garage sale and they don't have any way of hooking it up. You can at least get an idea of what you're dealing with. The other nice thing to use a battery for is sometimes speaker manufacturers didn't really label very well which one's positive and negative. Sometimes there's no indicator at all. And if you're wanting to find out which one's the positive side and which one's the negative side, put one wire to the negative and one to the positive. And if the woofer pushes forward, then you've got the polarity correct. Then the negative is correct and the positive is correct. So that's pulling in. So that means that this is my negative and this is my positive. If I reverse them, it should push the woofer out instead of pull in, and it does. So whatever is connected to this wire is the positive, and whatever's connected to this wire is the negative. And that can be really helpful if you pull your woofers out to refoam or whatnot, and like I say, they didn't do a good job of indicating which one's the positive and the negative. With the advent of cell phones and the fact that you have a really nice camera in your hand all the time, before you remove the wires, take a picture of it. But if you forgot, you can always do this, and that'll at least help you figure out which one's the positive and which one's the negative. Hope you got something out of it. Hopefully these help you isolate an issue you might be having with your stereo, and that way it can help save money. Rather than taking all three pieces in, you can just take the piece in that really needs the attention, and that really could save you quite a bit of money. Also, if I missed something, if there's something you do when you're troubleshooting and it's worked for you, put it in the comments. Everybody's learning together, and everybody's sharing what they've learned over the years is definitely going to help somebody else out, maybe new to the hobby or just getting into this, that might not know these simple tips, tricks, troubleshooting, hacks, whatever you might want to call it. And I'd love to get a new one to put in my arsenal as well. So I really appreciate you watching. Don't forget to check out skylabsaudio.com/shop for cool t-shirts, platter mats, speaker stands, all that kind of cool stuff. And we will see you in the next one. Thank you very much.